I'm Van Romans, president of the Museum of Science and History, and I want to welcome you all here tonight. We're so terribly fortunate to have a unique opportunity to hear what I consider one of America's great creative leaders, Disney Ambassador Marty Sklar. To introduce Marty is a challenge because he's accomplished so much, but beyond that, I'm going to say something more personal, and that is that he was my mentor, he was my colleague, and now he's my friend. And on top of it all, I think he still believes I worked for him. And I may, and I don't even know it. But anyway, that is another issue. Walt Disney guided the creative philosophy and process of Disney parks from 1952 to 1966, during which time Walt opened Disneyland. Well, Marty began his Disney career at Disneyland in June of 1955, 1 month before Disneyland opened. He was hired to create the Disneyland News, a tabloid newspaper sold on Main Street for about 10 cents during Disneyland's first summer. 2 weeks after he started, at age 21, by the way, Marty had to present the newspaper concept to Walt Disney. Fortunately, Walt liked it, and today Marty will say that was his career. For 54 years he was successful because that one presentation sort of made it for him, and that was great. He's the only Disney cast member to participate in the opening of all 11 Disney parks around the world and give creative direction to all of those parks. So that's exceptional, of course. And in 2001, he became a Disney legend. Along the way, he generously nurtured and mentored at least 2 generations of creative leaders, both inside and outside of Disney. His influence can be seen and felt in every professional in the industry. Marty and his willingness to allow talent to soar is really, really key to so many people's success. I'm so very proud to introduce a national treasure to you this evening. Please give Disney Ambassador Marty Sklar a great big welcome to Fort Worth, Texas.
Thanks, Dan.
You're welcome.
Well, thanks, Van. I don't know what to say about that, except what a great time I had here at the museum yesterday and today, touring this really wonderful museum and seeing all the kids having fun and learning. It was a really wonderful experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about my 2 books, one of which I think we have tonight, The One Little Spark. The other one is a memoir I did about 2 years ago. Actually started when I retired. So I'm often asked what I missed most when I'm now that I'm retired after 54 years at Disney, and it's really an easy answer. It's the people, the Imagineers I led creatively for 30 of those years, and they had so much talent, so much passion for creating great fun and entertainment and learning experiences. So much can you top this attitude. And when you read One Little Spark, you will definitely see there's so many different ways that all of these creative people got to where they are. Well, Van was one of my key associates, and we did so many great projects together. Now, imagine putting museum-quality shows in an amusement park. People thought we were nuts. No one ever attempted it before, right, Van? Yeah, but Van did it in Epcot pavilions, China, Mexico, Norway, Morocco, Japan. I became well known by my Walt Disney Imagineering colleagues for a cliche that drove the Disney Imagineers in new creative directions. This is the principle that I gave my staff. There are two ways to look at a blank sheet of paper. One way is to see it as the most frightening thing in the world because you have to make that first mark on that blank page. Now, here's the other way, the Imagineering way, is to see a blank page as the greatest opportunity in the world because you get to make the first mark on it. Well, Van was one of those who took my direction as one of the great challenges in the park and resort business and literally changed the guest experience in our Disney parks with great stories told through special exhibitions and made possible by his patience and skill in dealing with government bureaucrats and private collectors from Beijing, China to Rabat, Morocco, and the most difficult negotiations of all in Washington, D.C., of course. Today I want to give you a peek inside the world where, as I mentioned, I spent half a century. So I decided to focus on a few of the most important lessons I learned before, during, and after my 54 years working at the Walt Disney Company. And I call this talk, The Best Advice I Ever Heard. Failure to prepare is preparing to fail. John Wooden, legendary UCLA basketball coach. When I was a student at UCLA in the 1950s, I was the sports editor of the student newspaper, and I was fortunate enough to know the greatest basketball coach in American university history. His name was John Wooden, and his teams won 10 national university championships in a 12-year period. I watched how Coach Wooden motivated his players with his leadership style and his preparation for every game. He told his basketball players, quote, "If opportunity knocks, be ready." And his most important advice, quote, "Make every day of your journey a masterpiece." Disneyland is good for you. John Hench, senior designer and philosopher of Walt Disney Imagineering, one of my mentors. John Hench believes that the Disney parks play an important part in reassurance in a busy urban world where technology causes constant change. He said the Disney parks reassure you that quality and good design are important, that people trust that their family will be treated with care and have fun, of course, and that things work because they have been carefully planned and designed. As designers, he said, we give power to the guest's imagination, enabling them to transcend their everyday routine. Walt Disney's insistence that our guests should feel better because of their experiences in a Disney park was, John said, at the heart of our success. Even though he began his Disney career as an artist working on Fantasia in 1939, John Hench never stopped learning and designed some of Disney's most iconic futuristic experiences. Here are two of the most famous designs. The original illustration for Space Mountain and the dramatic impression of Disneyland's first monorail system illustrated in 1959. When you believe something, believe in it all the way. Have confidence in your ability to do it right. Walt Disney. Well, for 10 years, I had the privilege of writing personal material for Walt Disney for use in television, publications, and the Disney parks marketing and sales and new projects. Walt was a creative visionary and leader who inspired all of us at the Walt Disney Company. Here are the words I wrote for him when he held a press conference to introduce the concept for Walt Disney World in Florida in 1965. Quote, "We keep moving forward, opening up new doors because we're curious. We're always exploring and experimenting. We've never lost our faith in family entertainment. Stories that make people laugh, stories about warm and human things. We're not out to make a fast dollar with gimmicks. We're interested in doing things that are fun, in bringing pleasure and especially laughter to people, and probably most important of all, when we consider a new project, we really study it, not just the surface idea, but everything about it. And when we go into that new project, we believe in it all the way. We have confidence in our ability to do it right, and we work hard to do the best possible job. Yes, if is the language of a deal maker. No, because is the language of a deal killer. Harrison Buzz Price, economist. Well, Buzz Price created and set the standards for evaluating the economic feasibility of major projects. He completed more than 3,000 studies for projects around the world. He also studied and recommended the actual locations for Disneyland in California and Walt Disney World in Florida. He invented this language and principle. Yes, if. If you analyze your objectives clearly, your idea or project should work. That's the language of a deal maker, someone who wants the project to work. Creative people, and this is very true, creative people love yes, if. Now, the opposite is someone who is negative. No, because. That's the language of a deal killer. Harrison Price's advice is clear. Be positive. Try to find a way, a yes, if, that will make your project successful. You can always change your plan, but only if you have one. Professor Randy Pausch, Carnegie Mellon University. Computer scientist Professor Randy Pausch was dying from cancer, but he presented a last lecture to his students that became a best-selling book. In his last lecture, he said, "Today's talk will be about achieving childhood dreams, but it's really about how you live your life. If you lead your life the right way, the dreams will come to you." So, he said, have a plan. Break it down into small steps. Take one step at a time. Take a chance. Walt Disney. Well, when I was first learning to write for Walt, I found a book written actually in the 1940s with advice from famous people around the world. Walt Disney's message was called Take a Chance. It said in part, quote, "In the lexicon of youth, there is no such word as fail." Walt concluded this way, quote, "If I'm no longer young in age, I hope I stay young enough in spirit never to fear failure, young enough still to take a chance and march in the parade." Walt Disney lived his take a chance philosophy his whole life. After all, he began making 8-minute cartoons, then created the first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and then he became a television host of his own program and a producer of films like Mary Poppins, and created Disneyland with a simple idea. He said it will be a place for people to find happiness and knowledge. He left a legacy of imagination, creativity, and willingness to take a chance that continues to this day.
You've become one of the few remaining connections back to Walt. Can you describe your very first personal talk or meeting with him?
Somebody recommended me to Disney, and went in for an interview, and they hired me to do a project Walt wanted to do, which was to put out a tabloid newspaper, 1890 style, on Main Street. So I started a month before Disneyland opened, as Van said earlier, in June of 1955, and 2 weeks after I went to work, I had to present the concept to the Walt Disney. And I was 21 years old and had never worked professionally, but I was scared as hell, let me tell you. And it really, when I look back at many years later, I realized that was the turning point in my career, and I couldn't get it in my head how Walt had time for this little thing I was doing that was going to be sold on Main Street for 10 cents. And then I realized what it was all about. For Walt Disney, Main Street was a real town. It was a real place. And in 1890, 1900, every little town in America had its own newspaper, at least one. So having that newspaper was a story point. And if you think about the parks, it's story and the detail in those stories and keeping you in the story, wherever you are in the park. And once I got that in my head, which was because of that experience, I understood the business, and it was a big step forward for me.
I thought it would be nice if you described what the objective was for Epcot.
It was Walt's concept for a community called Epcot, Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. He was really focused on creating a community because he was so optimistic about the future that he wanted people to understand that and feel it themselves. And so he would go around to the laboratories of all these great companies, IBM and GE and the Sarnoff Labs at RCA. When Walt Disney came to these laboratories, they would pull out whatever future stuff they were working on, and they'd show it to Walt. And he'd say, well, when can I buy that as a product? And they'd say, well, we don't know whether the public is interested in this. So he came to feel that he could be kind of a middleman between industry and the public, and presenting ideas about the future that were changing all the time. And that was the whole genesis of Epcot. Well, after Walt died, all of a sudden we had 28,000 acres of land in Florida and no leader. I mean, the man who created all this was gone, and it took a lot of guts for Roy Disney, Walt's brother, and the management of Disney to carry on at that time on a piece of land that's twice as large as Manhattan Island.
What's the concept when people say Walt would talk about meeting the needs of people?
He was always looking at what frustrated him, his family, and people he knew, and wanting to correct that and make it better. And what was fabulous about it was that he made it clear to us that he was not going to repeat himself. He was going on to something else. And you either got on board or you got left behind. So we had to continue to grow, to learn new things, to continue to understand things that we could, new technologies, for example, that we could implement in our parks. So inspiration was number one. Number two was trust. Once he trusted you, you had so much freedom to do almost anything and not be interfered with until you had something that you really wanted to show him. And the third thing was optimism. And I'm telling you, this world needs a lot more optimism because there's so much negativism. And Walt was the eternal optimist. He always thought that he could find something or do something that would improve people's experience or people's lives.
When you wrote those Mickey's 10 Commandments, I just was wondering who the audience was supposed to be.
So I developed the Mickey's 10 Commandments as a structure for talking about Imagineering because everybody wanted to know, how does Disney do it? You can't be negative about something that didn't work. If you're not failing from time to time, you're not doing anything new. You're just repeating what you did before. And because we all make mistakes, and that's not a cardinal sin. You know what? You've got to keep going. You make a mistake and you fix it. You go on, you learn from it. And that's really important.
So who was your mentor?
One was, I showed in the picture, John Hench, who was my partner in creating Epcot and Tokyo Disneyland and other parks. John started with Walt, as I said, on Fantasia, 1939, and he was a very good friend of Salvador Dali, and they're just so, he was so creative and I would tell you that there's probably nobody in the world who understood the philosophy of color and the effect of color on people any better than John Hench. He was brilliant about things like that. Another one was Herbert Ryman, who was probably one of two artists that Walt Disney particularly loved. Herb Ryman and Peter Ellenshaw was the other. And Herbie drew the first drawing of Disneyland over a weekend. Almost every project we did for many years, he did the first piece of art, Walt Disney World, Tokyo Disneyland, Paris, etc. He spent so much time teaching young people, and here's the thing that started. He said, young people aren't given the training that he got at the Chicago Art Institute, for example. And what was that? Learn to draw.
So if Walt came back, would he be really proud of you?
Oh, Van.
What would he?
You know, for
What would
20
he say?
years or more, I got the question all the time, what would Walt say? What would Walt? I never answered that question. I never tried to. How can you? You know? But then we built Hong Kong Disneyland, and so I finally decided, okay, I'm going to answer the question for the first time. So they said, well, what would Walt think? And I said, he would say, what took you so long? So I want to thank all my hosts and for setting up this program tonight, and all of you who make public museums possible. It's really with your support that they exist and they thrive, as this one is.